All right, here we go. We're going to finish the essay, Talking Past Each Other, Black and White Languages of Race by Bob Blonner. Confounding race and ethnicity is not just limited to the young. The general public, including journalists and other opinion makers, does this regularly with serious consequences for clarity of public dialogue and sociological analysis. A clear example comes from the Chicago mayoral election of 1983. The establishment press, including leading liberal columnists, regularly chastised the Black electorate for giving virtually all of its votes to Harold Washington. Such racial voting was as racist as whites voting for the other candidate because they did not want a Black mayor. Yet African Americans were voting for ethnic representation, just as Irish Americans, Jews, and Italians have always done. Such ethnic politics is considered the American way. What is discriminatory is the double standard that does not confer the same rights on Blacks, who were not voting primarily out of fear or hatred, as were many whites. Such confusions between race and ethnicity are exacerbated by the ambiguous sociological status of African Americans. Black Americans are both a race and an ethnic group. Unfortunately, part of our heritage of racism has been to deny the ethnicity, the cultural heritage of Black Americans. Liberal-minded whites have wanted to see Blacks as essentially white people with Black skins. Until the 1960s, few believed that Black culture was a real ethnic culture. Because our racial language is so deep-seated, the terminology of Black and white just seems more natural and commonsensical than more ethnic labels like African American or European American. But the shift to the term African American has been a conscious attempt to move the discourse from a language of race to a language of ethnicity. African American, as Jesse Jackson and others have pointed out, connects the group to its history and culture in a way that the racial designation Black does not. I will not argue this, by the way. I'm just reading it, okay? Either way. So it's not my place to do that. The new usage parallels terms, but I can tell you as a white person, has made me very confused because I've had different conversations about that. But moving on. The new usage parallels terms for other ethnic groups. Many whites tend to dismiss this concern about language as mere sloganeering, but African American fits better into the emerging multicultural view of American ethnic and racial arrangements, one more appropriate to our growing diversity. The old race relations model was essentially a view that generalized, often inappropriately, from Black-white relations. It can no longer capture, if it ever could, the complexity of a multiracial and multicultural society. So that is the author's argument for using African American instead of Black. The issue is further complicated by the fact that African Americans are not a homogeneous group. They comprise a variety of distinct ethnicities. There are the West Indians with their long histories in the US, the darker Puerto Ricans, some of whom identify themselves as Black, the more recently arrived Dominicans, Haitians, and immigrants from various African countries, as well as the native-born African Americans, among whom regional distinctions can also take on a quasi-ethnic flavor. And this really refers to me being a Spanish teacher, and when I'm teaching Spanish, students will often question Black people speaking Spanish, and I struggle because I'm like, a language does not indicate a race. So all races can speak all languages. They are not, they cannot necessarily be predominantly one or the other due to colonialization. So Blacks from the Caribbean are especially likely to identify with their homeland rather than taking on a generic Black or even African American identity. The idea of African American or Black is uniquely American and uniquely colonial. And that's a reference that I know I've read some things about. If you go to Africa, they don't consider themselves Black. They don't use that as a checkbox or a way to identify themselves. Okay, they might identify themselves as the country they're from or the area they're from, or there's lots of different scenarios. So I'll let you guys look that stuff up on your own for now. Blacks will, again, connect to, where they're from. So while they may resist the dynamic of racialization and even feel superior to Native Blacks, the dynamic is relentless. Their children are likely to see themselves as part of a larger African American population, and yet many Native-born Americans of African descent also resist the term African American, feeling very little connection to the original homeland. Given the diversity in origin and outlook of America's largest minority, it is inevitable that no single concept can capture its full complexity or satisfy all who fall within its bounds. And I'm going to talk about this idea later, but this idea of not connecting to Black or to African American also takes on its own mantra in the Hispanic or Latino community called mejorar la raza, and that has to do with whitening the race or improving the race by marrying into or having children with lighter skinned people. And that's racism, or, not segregation, but, that in and of itself is also what has happened with the white authority pushing down and always being in power, is that mejorar la raza means that you will maybe have easier life in that regard. So, and there's lots of things that go with it. So I don't want you guys to just be like, oh, it's this, and it's a lot of things. So if that's something you're interested in looking at, because it's still, it's something that I talk about in my classes, but that's not for now, but I'll talk about it later. So for white Americans, race does not overwhelm ethnicity. Whites see the ethnicity of other whites. It is their own whiteness they tend to overlook. But even when race is recognized, it is not conflated with ethnicity. Jews, for example, clearly distinguish their Jewishness from their whiteness, yet the long-term dynamic still favors the development of a dominant white racial identity. Except for recent immigrants, the various European ethnic identities have been rapidly weakening. Vital ethnic communities persist in some cities, particularly on the East Coast, but many whites, especially the young, have such diverse ethnic heritages that they have no meaningful ethnic affiliation. In my classes, only the Jews among European Americans retain a strong sense of communal origin. Instead of dampening the ethnic enthusiasms of racial minorities, perhaps it would be better to encourage the revitalization of whites' European heritages. But a problem with this approach is that the relationship between race and ethnicity is more ambiguous for whites than for people of color. Although many white groups' ethnicity has been a stigma, it also has been used to gain advantages that have marginalized Blacks and other racial minorities, particularly for working class whites today. Ethnic community loyalties are often the prism through which they view their whiteness or their superiority. Going to skip a little. If the European Americans forming their clubs and truly organizing on an ethnic or pan-ethnic rather than, okay, so there's an argument that, okay, so for example, at my school, if I were to just call our Hispanic Club, I will have students who will say, well, I'm just going to make a white club. And so that is something that we're still struggling to push through today. And that's one of those microaggressions, I suppose you could call it if you choose. But this is kind of that's an example of what this is talking about. If the European Americans forming their clubs are truly organizing on an ethnic or pan-ethnic rather than a racial model, so it's not the white club, but maybe the Dutch club or the German club or the, because there are authentic things, or maybe it's a race back to your cultural heritage or whatever. Despite all the ambiguities, it seems to me a gain in social awareness when a specific group comes to be seen in ethnic rather than racial terms. During the period of the mass immigration of the late 19th century and continuing through the 1920s, Jews, Italians, and other white ethnics were viewed racially. We no longer hear of the Hebrew race, and it is rare for Jewish distinctiveness to be attributed to biological rather than cultural roots. Of course, the shift from racial to ethnic thinking did not put an end to anti-Semitism in the United States or to genocide in Germany, where racial imagery was obviously intensified. It is unrealistic to expect that the racial groupings of American society can be totally deconstructed, as a number of scholars are now advocating. After all, African Americans and Native Americans who are not immigrants can never be exactly like other ethnic groups. Yet a shift in this direction would begin to move our society from a divisive biracialism to more inclusive multiculturalism. So that's his argument for that. And then, so I'm going to skip a couple of paragraphs and we're going to end with this last one. Will this widened conflict finally lead Americans toward a recognition of our common stake in the health of the inner cities and their citizens, or toward increased fear and division? The Emmett Till lynching in 1955 set the stage for the first mass mobilization of the civil rights movement. The Montgomery bus boycott later that year, Martin Luther King's assassination provided the impetus for the institution of affirmative action and other social programs. The Rodney King verdict and its aftermath must also become not just a psychologically defining moment, but an impetus to new mobilization of political resolve. And so what I am going to attempt to do is put this essay online. That way, if you guys would like to reference it, you can do so. I'm not trying to make this a class or anything like that. It's just me trying to show you what background has provided me to move forward in identifying the biases that I have myself. This essay is full of a lot of, I would say, academic vocabulary, in which a couple of key pieces that we could talk about more. And I can try and put that together because I don't want to just leave it like is. And so I will follow up this video with some notes or some things that I draw, and how it's just so unfortunate right now that history is repeating itself yet again. There are so many corollaries that we can make between this writing, which was, I'm not sure, maybe 1992. This book is copyrighted for 1999, but we're here 21 years later, still doing the same thing, just the names change. You know, that's unreal. It's crazy. So thank you for listening, and I am open to any conversations about the reading. Take care, guys.